So now I'd like to briefly talk about the three waves of feminism. So the first wave refers to the fight for women's suffrage. And the women's suffrage movement was a decades-long fight to win the right to vote for women. It took activists and reformers nearly 100 years to win that right. On August 18, 1920, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution was finally ratified, enfranchising all American women and declaring for the first time that they, like men, deserve all the rights and responsibility of citizenship. And feminism's second wave was the women's movement that began in the 1960s and 70s. If first wave feminists were inspired by the abolition movement and securing women's right to vote, the second wave feminists were inspired by the civil rights movement and the attendant discussion of principles such as equality and justice, and also ferment caused by protests against the Vietnam War. They sought to end employment discrimination, unequal pay, legal inequity, and meager support services for working women that need to be corrected through legislative guarantee of equal pay for equal work, equal job opportunities, and expanded government-supported childcare services. The Equal Pay Act of 1963 offered the first guarantee, and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was amended to bar employers from discriminating on the basis of sex. Groups such as the National Organization for Women launched a campaign for legal equity, while ad hoc groups staged sit-ins and marches for any number of reasons, including assailing the college curricula that lacked female authors. Health collectives and rape crisis centers were established. Children's books were rewritten to eliminate sexual stereotypes. Women's studies departments were founded at colleges and universities. Some historians talk about a third wave of feminism that focused on the struggle against male domination by the, quote, patriarchy. Influenced by postmodern thought, third wave feminists sought to question traditional ideas about gender identity, beauty, sexuality, and to deal with issues of race and class oppression. So I'd like to give just one example of a feminist writer, the bisexual feminist Marxist author of Sexual Politics, which was published in 1970. She argued that the failure of women to extricate from the patriarchy of the monogamous nuclear family reflected false consciousness, which is a Marxist term. Having babies and taking care of them reduced women to, quote, the cultural level of animal life, in providing the male with sexual outlet and exercising the animal functions of reproduction and care of the young. She was praised as the high priestess and the Mao Zedong of the women's movement by Time magazine. The New York Times said that her book was the Bible of women's liberation. She attacked as fascistic and counter-revolutionary societies that emphasize family over sexual freedom. One reviewer praised her in this way, quote, Millett invented feminist literary criticism. Before her, it did not exist. Her urgent, elegant 1970 masterwork Sexual Politics, with its wry takedowns of the casual misogyny and rape scenes that had made the reputations of the sexual revolutionaries du jour, Norman Mailer, Henry Miller, D.H. Lawrence, introduced a new and remarkably durable idea. You could interpret literature in light of its gender dynamics. You could go to novels and poems for an education in sex as power. You may not agree that literature is a proper medium for consciousness raising, but you cannot deny that Millett made reading a life-changing, even world-changing act. Yes, the fact that many literature classes view novels of all kinds solely from the viewpoint of male-female power dynamics can be attributed to Kate Millett. By doing so, they are drawing students into a narrow world of resentment where you get to feel morally superior to people in the past who had to struggle to create the world which we take for granted. Now, her sister, Mallory Millett, wrote an article named Marxist Feminism's Ruined Lives. In that article comes the account of a consciousness raising group meeting led by her sister, Kate Millett. So I'd like to ask the women in the audience here, you are playing the role of women attending this consciousness raising session, and I will play the role of Kate Millett. So Kate Millett, she asked, where are we today? And the women said, okay, to make a revolution, right? What kind of revolution?
The cultural revolution.
And how do we make the cultural revolution, she demanded. But by destroying the American family, she came back. All right, and then they said,
by destroying the American patriarch.
And how do we destroy the American patriarch?
By taking away his power.
And how do we do that?
By destroying monogamy.
And how do we destroy monogamy?
By promoting promiscuity, eroticism, prostitution, and homosexuality.
Okay, that's the account written by her sister Mallory. Good job, Karen, thank you. All right. So her sister Mallory speaks tragically of encountering women in their 50s and 60s who fell for this creed in their youth and now cry themselves to sleep many countless nights, grieving for the children that they will never have and that they, quote, coldly murdered because they were protecting the empty, loveless futures they now live with no way of going back. Quote, where are my children? They cried to Mallory. Where are my grandchildren? One woman told her, your sister's books destroyed my sister's life. Another piece of cultural wreckage for the revolution is that women who do not go along with allowing transgender women, who are actually biological men, to compete against women in sports are being condemned as bigoted. Even the tennis champion Martina Navratilova, a lesbian who's been a champion for gay rights for many decades, has been thrown under the bus for speaking out against the latest woke narrative. She was criticized after tweeting, quote, you can't just proclaim yourself a female and be able to compete against women. There must be some standards, and having a penis and competing as a woman would not fit that standard. Feminist organizations won't speak out to defend a gay woman advocating for women's rights to compete against other women, because they are not really about defending women. They are more concerned to support whatever destroys Judeo-Christian values and advances the leftist agenda. The transgender issues relate to the idea of intersectionality, a part of critical race theory, which was developed by a legal theorist named Kimberly Crenshaw. She argued that sexual and racial minorities cannot succeed in America because of systemic racism and sexism. Equal access and equal opportunity were not enough. Needed change will come by asserting their victim status and demanding redress by an ever-expanding government. Past victimhood should be the basis for racial quotas in education, employment, redistribution of wealth, and proposed reparations. Now just think how reductionistic and insulting this is. All human beings should be viewed according to their race, class, or sexuality. In other words, according to their group. I'll concede that this may be extremely useful for political purposes. I have a question for any black brothers or sisters who are watching. Do you really think that all people with darker skin are the same? Even within your own family, are all of your siblings the same in temperament, interests, or talents? Do all gay people have the same exact views or interests? Are all women the same? This is using group identity to advance a political agenda. This is a regression to treating people as members of groups in order to use government power to advantage certain groups at the expense of others. Then there's the imposition of transgender ideology on first-year students at medical schools all across the United States. An example is a lesson on gender ideology for first-year Indiana University School of Medicine students that teaches them to call women people with cervixes. A number of medical school professors are warning that this will have very detrimental effects to the health profession. Let me give you an example. Here is Dr. Kenneth Zucker, a sexologist and psychologist who ran the Center for Addiction and Mental Health Gender Identity Clinic in Toronto for more than 30 years. He was fired after a trans activist smear campaign. His crime was suggesting that perhaps we should first try to help children feel comfortable in their own bodies. Research shows that 80% of youth who experienced gender dysphoria come to accept their biological sexual identity by late adolescence. But who cares? We have to push them to mutilate their bodies first and let them pick up the wreckage of their lives later. Did you know that young people and adults who take hormone drugs to reverse their biological sex characteristics in order to transition to the opposite sex have an increased risk of suffering a stroke or heart attack? Do you think that young people with gender dysphoria are fully informed about these serious risks to their health? Isn't that a violation? No, the answer is no. Isn't that a violation of the medical ethical standard of informed consent, developed after the Nuremberg trials of medical doctors who experimented on Jews and other minorities in Nazi Germany? It's one thing for an adult to choose to endanger their health and their physical life. But to give these powerful hormonal drugs to children who may not understand the implications is simply criminal in my opinion. Fortunately, gender-confused transition teenagers are beginning to sue the doctors and hospitals who push them into taking these powerful drugs and having radical surgery. A teenager named Layla Jane is suing the medical providers who performed a double mastectomy on her when she was just 13 years old, after she began to identify as transgender 2 years before. Now 18 years old, Jane is accusing the hospital system of, quote, intentional fraud and concealment involving her gender transition, alleging the doctors pushed her into the procedure and characterized her gender transition as the only way to treat her pre-existing mental health problems. Jane said that she previously struggled with mental health, including suicidal thoughts, before deciding to transition going into adolescence. Her attorney, Harmeet Dillon, alleged Jane's caregivers failed to administer the necessary mental health treatments before performing the double mastectomy and never informed her that 80% of teenagers eager to transition decide not to do so later. Jane's lawsuit alleged that doctors warned her of an increased risk of suicide if she failed to transition to being a male, adding that they gave her parents a binary option of having a dead daughter or a live son. Returning to feminist writers, you have articles on left-wing websites like Open Democracy, which is funded by George Soros, including an article by Sophie Lewis. The article is called "The Coronavirus Shows It's Time to Abolish the Family," and this was published in 2020. She's the author of a book called Full Surrogacy Now, Feminism Against Family. And she is a freelance writer interested in queer communism based in Philadelphia. She argues that the pandemic is no time to forget about family abolition. In the words of feminist theorist and mother, Madeline Lane McKinley, households are capitalism's pressure cookers. This crisis will see a surge in housework, cleaning, cooking, caretaking, but also child abuse, molestation, intimate partner rape, psychological torture, and more. Far from a time to acquiesce to family values ideology, then, the pandemic is an acutely important time to provision, evacuate, and gently empower survivors of and refugees from the nuclear household. And thirdly, even when the private nuclear household poses no direct physical or mental threat to one's person, no spouse battering, no child rape, no queer bashing, the private family qua mode of social reproduction still frankly sucks. It genders, it nationalizes and races us. It norms us for productive work. It makes us believe that we are individuals. It minimizes costs for capital while maximizing human beings' life-making labor. Across billions of tiny boxes, each kitted out absurdly with its own kitchen and laundry. She seems to be upset that most families in capitalist societies have their own kitchens, washing and drying machines. This is just one example of ongoing anti-family Marxist rhetoric among the feminist left. Ironically, there's more opportunity and freedoms for marginalized individuals and groups in the nations that guarantee freedom. Nations with more centralized power will never be able to provide the same range of freedoms and opportunities. How much compassion do you hear from critics of America and the West for the plight of women in poor countries? You hear deafening silence from most feminists about the literal sexual enslavement of women in the Islamic world. For example, the Yazidi women who tell of rape and enslavement at the hands of ISIS. Since the Yazidis have a different religion, the Islamic fundamentalists and ISIS fighters believe they are justified to use them as sex slaves. So I'd like to play a video.
Go with them, she says. So they beat the girls and dragged them away by force. Farida was raped repeatedly for 3 months. They sold me from one man to the next, she says. The ordeal was even harder for the younger ones. They raped girls who were 9, 10 years old, or even 8, she says. They would say the older ones know something about men, while the younger ones know nothing. Haweda is one of those innocents that the ISIS fighters sought out. She's just 12. She didn't know what rape meant, only that she woke up bleeding. He was old, she says, about the man who bought her. He was 50. Somehow Haweda escaped, but she's so badly traumatized that only now, 3 months later, is she able, haltingly, to even speak again.
Okay, there you have it. There's the women that most feminist organizations never defend, never talk about, don't seem to care much about. In the conservative Yazidi culture, rape victims are often stigmatized and shunned by their families and communities. Occasionally, though, love flourishes after tragedy. Take 16-year-old Reem, who escaped from ISIS in 2014 after being held captive for 4 months. After her escape, Reem joined her mother, brothers and sisters in a camp for displaced people, where she met Barzan, a 22-year-old builder. It was love at first sight, they both said, and they were married. Reem told NBC News that she now has Barzan to protect her. Dividing up humanity by race or by gender and pitting the groups against each other may help to cause chaos and undermine society for the revolution, but it doesn't improve people's lives. The real division in the world is not between men versus women or white against black. It's between good and evil. It's between men and women who try to be decent and unselfish versus those who want to steal and destroy, whether for themselves, for the true Islamic State, or for the revolution. The woke agenda is not to solve problems. It doesn't care about women, who are now being forced to undress in front of biological males in school locker rooms. It doesn't care about gays, and it doesn't care about gender-confused boys and girls. It cares about seizing power to force people to fit into their imaginary world of perfect equality, where no one is free, where the government decides what we are allowed to say, what our youth are taught or not taught, where children are raised by the state, not by their parents, who may not even be informed if their son or daughter is being coaxed into making life-changing decisions by government employees.